Tom Wolfe's 1968 book, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, is a Gonzo tale about a group of hygienically challenged hippies who travel around the United States and Mexico holding acid festivals and causing Day-Glo mayhem. Writer Ken Kesey of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest fame is the non-leader of a group called the Merry Pranksters, who bedeck a bus with psychedelic art and outfit it with state-of-the-art AV equipment. As they roam around North America on a variety of misadventures, the Merry Pranksters run into a list of groups and people that reads like a who's who of countercultural 1960s America, from Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, aka Guru Ram Dass, to the Hells Angels, the Unitarian Universalists, and the Grateful Dead. In many ways, Kesey was handed the sociocultural torch that had been, if not lit, then faithfully borne by the Beats, who included writers and poets like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and, of course, my own spirit animal, the inimitable gentleman junkie himself, William Burroughs. These artists had completely rejected the Wonder Bread society of 1950s America, which was as stifling as it was boring, as dishonest as it was silently desperate. A white picket fence, 2.5 children per couple hell, where social conformity was prized above all else, consumerism became the true religion, and many a housewife never woke up for her 6 a.m. amphetamine and hair curler routine because she'd taken an extra Seconal with her cocktail the night before. Now, the Beats had become turned on to psychedelics, substances that had originally been called psychomimetic or psychodelic for their propensity to mimic psychosis. There's a warning in the name, right? However, it was mostly geeks like Richard Alpert and Timothy Leary, who had been Harvard professors, who'd pioneered research into these chemicals, and they were careful to embed their activities in this meditative, sort of retiring Eastern spirituality. They were into Buddhism and other Eastern spiritual movements like Taoism, and they presented what they were doing more as spiritual retreat than as, like, cultural change making, and that really protected them. So for his part, Kesey tried acid sourced from a Palo Alto lab during his stint as a graduate writing fellow at Stanford, and from the start, he and the Merry Pranksters had no intention of cloistering themselves away as the Beats had. Kesey in particular quickly seized on LSD as a way to fundamentally alter the fabric of society, to create IRL superheroes even. Not surprisingly, Kesey's in-your-face acid evangelism put him on a collision course with mainstream society almost from day one of the Merry Pranksters' antics. Now, Tom Wolfe returns to this thesis he has that the Merry Pranksters were essentially like sociologically and metaphysically accessing a spiritual or religious state again and again in the course of his tale. Kesey, for his part, believed that he had discovered not just a secret, but the secret in LSD and other psychedelics. The first part of the book frequently returns to the concept of intersubjectivity, of the breakdown of the boundaries between people and even between humans and the rest of the universe, which can sometimes seem to happen or actually happen depending on your belief system under the influence of psychedelics. Just as Ram Dass promises in his free-ranging art and philosophy book called Be Here Now, Kesey and the Merry Pranksters believed that they were acquiring superpowers, that they were manifesting miracles, that they were entering the very mind of God. Now, in terms of the day-to-day reality of inhabiting the mind of God, cue the Merry Pranksters loading onto their psychedelically decorated bus and acid blitzkrieging mainstream society. Imagine walking down the street in your fastidiously ironed three-piece suit on the way to your square job at a Mad Men-style advertising agency. As you walk, you come across a band of theatrically dressed, in fact, mostly undressed, people whose mix of races and ages is almost unheard of in the U.S. of your day. No, officer, it was a cap gun, and they were saying they turned me on. I don't know what it meant, but it sounded like it was no good, I'll tell you that. Their names, well, I heard one of the girls call herself Mary Magdalene, I think. There's also a guy called Chief Gonorrhea and a pudgy woman named Lapdog, too. No, sir, I guess you can. For every panicky letter to the editor that the pranksters instigated, though, there were a handful of squares who were taken in by the pranksters' vitality and creativity, who realized that they were long past ready for a change. The combination of Kesey's charisma and the freewheeling antics of the rest of the Merry Prankster crew was simply too much to resist. If you'll permit me, quick tangent here. One of the most enjoyable aspects of the book was this. It was reading the names that the Merry Pranksters and their orbiters chose for themselves. Names like Stark Naked, Merry Microgram, Black Mary, Hassler, Mountain Girl, The Hermit, Babs. There is this hilarious motif in Wolfe's recounting of the Merry Prankster ordeal, which involves some group member or other with an outre hippie name getting arrested, after which the remainder of the group, upon bailing him or her out, learns that their comrade's birth name was not Coyote Vulva, but rather Evelyn Putnam, not Leering Wheel, but Jonathan Hadley III. Of course, these chosen names weren't just nicknames to them. These proto-hippies were preoccupied with identifying and transcending their trips, which are sort of like karmic, socially ingrained challenges and limitations that are foisted upon us all from childhood onward. To them, one's birth name is not just in many ways the original trip, it's also one of the most powerful trips of all, and choosing a new name for oneself from time to time is thus a technique of self-liberation. In addition to a colorful lineup of characters, the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test features an intriguing cast of psychoactive chemicals. It's not just LSD that the Merry Pranksters are experimenting with. Weed and speed, specifically benzodrine and dexedrine, make regular appearances as well. Alarmingly, in fact, it seems that Cassidy rarely drives the bus without amphetamine assistance. As much as I want to clutch my pearls about the impaired driving, I guess I'm getting older. Let's face it, any druggie worth his or her salt knows that person who is so used to driving impaired that they're better at driving that way than they are sober. Disappointingly for me, given my pharmacologic predilections, Seconal, Tuinal, and the other dolls, not to mention chloral hydrate, Placidol, methaqualone, and some of the other depressant drawer pharmaceutical novelties of the day, don't make even a single appearance in the book, not even to end a bad trip, which kind of surprised me. The Merry Pranksters are simply too hyped up for that. They are not downer people on any level. However, I can report by way of consolation that the pranksters have on board an experimental super speed called IT-290, which is alpha-methyltryptamine, a psychedelic stimulant, as well as this really interesting chemical called ditran, which is an anticholinergic compound related to chemical warfare agent developed by the U.S. government for its non-lethal but mentally incapacitating effects. So think MK Ultra on that one. Wolfe summarizes ditran as quote-unquote always a bad trip. By the way, if you're like me and you're worrying about or wondering about the dosing details, Wolfe unfortunately doesn't provide a huge amount of detail. He is not a chemist, and a lot of times these people are just taking like huge amounts of powders of various types and dumping them into like communal orange juice and Kool-Aid anyway, so it's not like they even knew. But he does mention some lower dose, like in the range of 70 microgram LSD trips early on in the pranksters' experimentations. However, the pranksters' leaders eventually ratchet up their intake to a whopping 1,000, 1,200, or even 16 micrograms of acid, which is massive dosing. So these are doses at which a pseudopsychotic state is often produced, in which if you value your brain, they should raise concerns of permanently acid frying it. And at that point, living in the eternal now might not be a choice any longer. What's genuinely amazing to realize, though, I think out of all the things in this story that once I put myself into it was really important to consider, was that many of these chemicals at the time were available to maybe 50 or 100 people in the entire world. Like, imagine having your first experience with magic mushrooms, and you're having that experience in an alternate reality where no one else in the entire world has ever experienced anything like those effects before. The pranksters' sometimes sort of like manic exuberance about psychedelics, it seems much more excusable and relatable. I think when you frame their chemical discoveries in that light, that they are literally, the first couple dozen people to have this chemical, and that they realize it could be of huge value, and they really take upon themselves to share it as widely as possible. So it didn't take too long, though, for the darker side of the Merry Pranksters' self-appointed mission to appear. On a cross-country road trip to meet with Beat Generation luminaries in an old money mansion outside of New York City, there's this young woman named Stark Naked, and she is tripping really hard on acid. And during this trip, the Merry Pranksters get off the bus, and they happen to run into a young boy who they stop and play with for a moment. Something is triggered in Stark Naked. She gives the little boy affection, she holds him, and afterwards she supernovas into a wailing breakdown that ends in a trip to the county psychiatric ward. Now, Wolfe notes parenthetically that Stark Naked signed away a child of similar age in her divorce agreement. I mention this because one of the most off-putting and limiting things about the book's narrative is that the focus on the all-powerful now means that almost no one knows or even cares to know anything about who people were before they joined the pranksters. Beyond a random biographical fact or two, like someone served in the military or, someone used to be, a pharmaceutical executive, the pranksters are essentially strangers to each other. This ends up being as limiting to the reader as it was to the pranksters themselves as a social movement, and it makes some of the most otherwise climactic episodes of Wolfe's story fall flat. So after their trip to New York City, the Merry Pranksters scale up their antics and begin holding acid fests up and down the West Coast. Music becomes the cornerstone of the application of their philosophy, and within a few years, the Grateful Dead is recognized as the inaugural acid rock band. Kesey himself is convinced that writing novels and writing in general is too dogmatic, too constraining to function as the ideal artistic medium. Thus, he and the pranksters become obsessed with using new AV equipment, along with homemade multimodal psychedelic art installations of incredible scope and immersiveness to enhance the LSD experience. If your life is burning well, poetry is just the ash, is something that singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen once said. I've always loved this quote, and I've always believed that police contact functions as sort of like the smoke in that analogy. After taking LSD was legal until the very end of Although taking LSD was legal until the very end of the timeline within which the events of the book unfold, acid was added to Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act in 1968, in fact. The Merry Pranksters drew the attention of law enforcement, from the beginning. So, at first, they are convinced that if they refuse to be drawn into the cop movie, the cop trip, meaning if they remain their goofy, provocative selves without consideration of potential consequences, they will be metaphysically protected from harm. Are you starting to see the magical thinking that earned the psychedelics their original names? Because I certainly am. Amazingly, this approach actually seemed to work, at least in the beginning. During one raid on Kesey's ranch in La Honda, California, the cops attempt to slip a vial of God knows what into one of the pranksters' pockets. However, the rest of the group sees this happening. They start jeering, play fair, man." And shockingly, the law enforcement officer actually puts the vial back into his own pocket. So, as the pranksters receive increasing attention, they come up against the limitations of their philosophy. Although the Hells Angels and even the Unitarian Universalists are won over by their psychedelic charm, law enforcement at different levels busts them repeatedly, and Kesey in particular ends up facing 2 marijuana possession charges that could result in 5 to 10 years behind bars. Kesey decides to pack up a lifetime supply of acid, weed, and speed, which should last him about a month, and head to Mexico, which Wolfe designates the land of all competent outlaws. Though I won't give away every detail of the plot out of respect for those of you who have yet to read the book and actually want to, I will say that a power struggle ensues among the pranksters' inner circle as Kesey descends into paranoia, as he stays ultra low profile in some very non-touristy areas of Mexico. Alright, so in terms of the style, we just talked about the story. In terms of the style, in trying to help his square readers to understand and perhaps even enter a state of mind whose spiritual or religious quality he emphasizes again and again, Wolfe does what any capable writer would do. He harnesses language itself to try to mimic the cognitive and perceptual changes that accompany LSD use. He uses words, that is to say, to cast an intoxicating spell upon his readers. Wolfe's prose is jaunty, it's alliterative, sometimes it's even brassy. It keeps coming and coming in these endless run-ons as the free association of ideas jumps from one topic to the next. Again and again, Wolfe depicts the pranksters' playful inhabitation of their senses, of the present moment, of the inner subjective now within which everyone and everything are. Short, free verse poems are included at the opening of certain chapters. To give you a feel for Wolfe's distinctive style, I'll read one now. So it says, "Can you pass the acid test?" Comes the call chiseled on each prankster eyeball in Lincoln Gothic as we moan in this graveyard among moonstone tombstones with a philosophic, "It's your ass. Can you pass the acid test?" Babs and Kesey swaying in a California graveyard, baying deep in the sink, zonked on LSD on the brink freaking steep of a missionary quest. Can you pass the acid test? Tombstones, vaults, coffins, and bald carbon-dated bones. So, believe it or not, again, that's one of these starting poems. A lot of the prose reads pretty similarly to that. So I'm going to be real with you, because what's the point of this if I'm not, right? Reading 100 pages written in this style was stylistically interesting, and it was also substantively useful in the sense of helping me to get closer to something like the group psychosis state of mind that the Merry Pranksters inhabited. Although Wolfe's writing wasn't as out there as, say, Burroughs' cut-up pieces, which are widely recognized as unreadable, perusing 400 pages of Wolfe's acid prose was a drag, as the pranksters themselves might have called it. I've read one of Wolfe's later books, which was a consideration of life at elite American universities, that is called I Am Charlotte Simmons, and that book was both more approachable and more interesting to me, at least in the end, than the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test was. Again, I understand that Wolfe wasn't shooting for approachable, but I found myself sort of dreading having to come home from work, my square job, right, sit down and read this book. I adore the other Wolfe, meaning Virginia Woolf, of course, as well as the work of many other pioneers of the stream of consciousness style and other experimental literary techniques. So it's not a problem with an experimental approach in general that makes me say this. To put it bluntly, just like the antics of the pranksters themselves, the style in which the story is related becomes tiresome after a while. In fact, the story itself was a bit like one of those segmented worms that you learn about in biology class, the ones that you can cut into tiny pieces, each of which will then regenerate a full individual. The many chapters of the book are really just a single story repeating itself over and over again. The Merry Pranksters encounter a new community, there's some initial interest and enthusiasm, and some converts are won. Then the problems and limitations of their philosophy becomes apparent as backlash grows and the pranksters sustain a casualty or two. Next, the consequences of the prankster spectacle become serious, perhaps even dangerous, as a result of which the pranksters move on to a new group and location. Rinse and repeat for hundreds of pages. For people who were sort of priding themselves on evolution, spiritual and otherwise, they didn't seem to get the point very quickly, and it was a little bit of an annoyance as a reader to read the same story again and again and again, you know? But okay, so we've talked about the style, we've talked about the story, and now the social substance of the book, meaning like, what does it mean to us today in 2025, if anything? So my initial reaction to this book's portrayal of the hippie movement that grew out of Kesey's and the Pranksters campaigns was like, damn, I wish we had a group like the Pranksters in today's society. The vibrant colors, the optimism about human nature and our own ability to shake up oppressive social and governmental structures, the belief that attaining a higher state of consciousness will transform not just society but the very universe. There is this childlike beauty and wonder to their perspective that has been largely lost in the modern world, according to me at least. If in today's reality you go on the internet and you search the word spirituality, you will be led down a truly endless rabbit hole of generic 5-minute installments of transcendence, all of which end with "buy my course at the link below." So just as the hippie movement coalesced around anti-Vietnam War activism, we have a rising tide of dark authoritarianism in the US right now. And amidst the daily panic attack-inducing onslaught of headlines, I can hardly imagine what it would mean to have philosophical and artistic leaders reach out and exhort us, as Ram Dass did, to be here now. Or, as Leary advised, to turn on, tune in, and drop out. The hippies' reminder that the social contract must, in order to be just and enforceable, have an opt-out clause is nothing short of sanity saving when I think about what it means to me and so many other people in 2025. We reserve the right, we always have and we always will, to get up and walk out of mainstream society in hopes of creating something better. So I will never forget my first mushroom trip, which I describe as stepping into starry night. When my thoughts stretched and snapped with the same taffy-like texture that my perceptions had taken on. I remember walking down the stairs and seeing the Christmas tree lit up at my mom's house, and seeing that was like it was the very first thing I had seen upon coming out of my mom's womb and, opening my eyes. It was incredible. So in 2025, we understand that such experiences aren't just psychological novelties. Finally, some members of the medical profession are acknowledging that what the rest of us have known for decades, namely that psychedelic experiences can produce powerful changes that in some individuals can help with anxiety, depression, breathlessness, and other mental health and social issues. However, the impact of these psychoactive agents is being neutered somewhat by their total clinicalization. There's almost no attention being given to what happens when we take these substances in groups, when we approach them not just therapeutically but also spiritually. What would happen if all of us decided to take a trip, to get on the bus, as the Merry Pranksters were forever putting it, together? To summarize, I believe that now more than ever, we could benefit from a selective, constructive application of the psychedelic mindset, and I also think that's unlikely to happen for a variety of reasons. If the psychedelic experience is an antidote to anything, it's to the destructive changes that social media have wrought on humanity as a whole. The degradation of our attention span due to our addictive fixation on obtaining small hits of dopamine. The senseless chasing of social approbation as reflected in likes and follows. The constant perseveration on the past and the future. And this eternal regression into the self, which cheapens and leads us astray rather than resulting in any constructive kind of introspection. Interestingly, during Kesey's time in Mexico, the vapid immaturity of the pranksters' approach to change-making was revealed by simple, unplanned, sort of artless juxtaposition. As Wolfe writes of the poor Mexicans in the desert island where Kesey is hiding out, he says they, meaning the Mexican locals, look at you just like a head, meaning an LSD user. They're totally open, wanting to find something rather than hide something. In other words, honest poverty renders psychedelic use all but unnecessary. There was, of course, a profound and far from benign irresponsibility underpinning Kesey's philosophy, which revealed its shallowness in the end. The manner in which the pranksters lived required the vast majority of all of the so-called squares and straights to carry capitalistic society forward with their jobs as factory workers, business people, teachers, telephone operators, healthcare professionals, farmers. The pranksters were closer to social parasites than they were to self-sustaining sovereign citizens. They didn't raise or hunt their own food. They didn't build their own shelters. They didn't even attempt to remove themselves from the grid or tend to their own medical care. Furthermore, they didn't even support their own tribe members in times of crisis. As I mentioned above, anyone experiencing an intense freakout was simply shipped back to family or dropped off at the nearest psychiatric center. Perhaps the most morally dubious moment in the whole Merry Prankster saga, though, arrives when Kesey is scheduled to speak at one of the largest anti-Vietnam War rallies in the country's history. Before the event, he covers the ears of another prankster and tells him to watch the current speaker. His facial expressions, his gesticulations, his whole manner. Who does he look like? Kesey asks this other prankster, who answers, Mussolini. Kesey is convinced that holding rallies, giving speeches, leading marches is just another facet of the same game that the fascist squares who support the Vietnam War are playing. He has this childish conviction that the Vietnam War will end, as he puts it, when huge groups of people simply turn away. Kesey's speech on that subject during what's supposed to be the climax of the pre-march rally punctures a hole in the crowd's enthusiasm. The organizers, on their part, are shocked and disappointed to hear him articulate this philosophy at this time. Kesey's flippant rejection of the importance of social activism of a certain type is one of the ugliest aspects of the prankster's tale, but it's also not a surprising one. When you come to depend upon substances to attain what you consider a higher state, you lose the ability not just to function on other levels, but to remember what it's like to be on them and to take those who exist in them seriously. Along with those losses comes Kesey's sort of enlightened ignorance, which conflates all impassioned action with aggression. Because of this nonsensical attitude, a huge amount of good that could have been accomplished with the pranksters' help never came to pass. Indeed, it never even entered the realm of possibility. Again, underneath what is being touted as an advance in consciousness is really a return to a childish irresponsibility, an impetuousness, and a short-sightedness. It is terrifying, actually terrifying for me to imagine to think of an entire country acting in the way that the Merry Pranksters did, which would be a scene much closer to the Purge than anything that looked like a utopia. By the end of the book, the pranksters' acid dogma has exploded in popularity, which has resulted in the vast fame of the Grateful Dead and a whole new paradigm of live music. It's resulted in the development of the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood in Berkeley, California. It's resulted in the rise to mainstream prominence of Ram Dass and many other social and spiritual fixtures of the hippie countercultural scene. However, Kesey's movement was in the end terminally limited by its manic shallowness, which became apparent to Wolfe and everyone else who spent long enough in its vicinity. For his own part, whether in order to reduce the legal penalties that he was facing for those marijuana cases or out of genuine reflection and reservation, Kesey came to believe that it was time to quote-unquote go further, to learn to inhabit and implement the LSD-inspired philosophy without the use of drugs. Of course, by the point that he came to this conclusion, the societal wildfire that he had started was raging out of control. Kesey himself lost relevancy almost as soon as he began to raise concerns. So to summarize, the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test is an anthropologically interesting tale that is worthwhile as much for teaching us how to fail as a socially transformative movement as it is for any lasting value or change wrought by Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. There are moments of beauty, profundity, and unbearable lightness. It is a tremendously human and above all an authentic tale. And we as readers end up loving the Merry Pranksters even though we recognize that we probably shouldn't. In the broader context of American society, at a time when once again we've descended into trouble, to quote the Grateful Dead, lately it occurs to me, what a long, strange trip it's been. Thank you all for listening. Please share your thoughts as well as your suggestions for next month's book club selection in the comments section below. And I hope you all have a wonderful day, night, whatever.